There are stories that belong to history and there are stories that belong to legend. And sometimes, when history is soaked in tragedy and repeated patterns of death, legend takes over. One such legend is whispered across the decades of American history, stitched into the rise and fall of its leaders. It is known as the Curse of Tippecanoe, or, more ominously, Tecumseh's Curse. The tale begins not in the marble halls of Washington, D.C., but in the dense forests and wide rivers of the American frontier. A time before the United States stretched from sea to shining sea. A time when native nations still held vast lands, and when conflict was inevitable. At the center of this story is a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh, a man remembered as one of the most gifted, strategic, and determined figures in Native American history. Tecumseh dreamed of something radical, a united confederacy of native nations standing together against American expansion. To his people, he was a visionary. To the U.S. government, he was a dangerous threat. Opposite him stood William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory. Harrison was ambitious, eager for glory, and hungry for land. Their paths would cross in violence at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, a clash that became the foundation of the curse. The story, as it has been told and retold, is this. After his defeat, Tecumseh or his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, pronounced a terrible curse. The curse was not just on Harrison, but on all presidents elected in a year ending in 0. Every 20 years, the legend says, death would come to the White House. And for more than a century, the pattern seemed unbreakable. Harrison in 1840. Lincoln in 1860. Garfield in 1880. McKinley in 1900. Harding in 1920. Roosevelt in 1940. Kennedy in 1960. One after another, presidents fell, cut down by disease, by bullets, by fate. Coincidence? Or curse? This is not just a tale of superstition. It is a story about the clash of civilizations, about the grief of a people who lost their land, and about the haunting ways in which history remembers tragedy. It is a story that begins with Tecumseh, the great Shawnee chief, and stretches all the way into the modern era. But before we can understand the so-called curse, we must first understand the world Tecumseh lived in. The frontier of early America, the dreams and despair of his people, and the fateful choices that would seal his name into American legend. This is the Curse of Tippecanoe. Before there could be a curse, there was a man. And before there was a man, there was a world on the edge of collapse. The early 1800s were a time of great upheaval on the North American frontier. The United States was a young nation, restless, expanding westward with unstoppable momentum. For the government in Washington, the land beyond the Appalachians was the future. For the native nations who lived there, it was home. Forests, rivers, hunting grounds, sacred places, all woven into centuries of tradition. But with each passing year, treaties were signed, often under pressure, sometimes by leaders who had little authority, sometimes through deception. Lands were ceded, villages uprooted, families displaced. What had once been an ocean of wilderness and native culture was shrinking under the weight of settlers' wagons and soldiers' boots. It was in this world that Tecumseh was born. He came into the Shawnee Nation in the year 1768, at a time when conflict between colonists and native peoples was already fierce. From a young age, he witnessed the violence and sorrow that would shape his life's mission. His father, Puckashinwau, was killed in battle against colonial militia. Tecumseh grew up with the conviction that his people's survival depended on unity and resistance. As a warrior, Tecumseh was brave and skilled, but it was his mind and his vision that made him exceptional. He saw what others feared to admit, that if native nations continued to face the United States separately, one by one, they would all fall. Only together could they hope to resist. Only through unity could they preserve their way of life. And so Tecumseh began to build something extraordinary. He traveled hundreds of miles, speaking to tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, urging them to join a confederacy, a pan-Indian alliance unlike anything seen before. His speeches were legendary, full of passion, dignity, and fire. Chiefs who heard him were moved. Warriors pledged loyalty. The idea of a native brotherhood began to take root. But Tecumseh was not alone in shaping this movement. He had a brother, known as Tenskwatawa, or the Prophet. While Tecumseh spoke of unity and resistance, Tenskwatawa spoke of spiritual renewal. He urged native peoples to reject the ways of the white settlers, their liquor, their clothing, their religion. He preached a return to traditional lifeways, to purity and discipline. Many flocked to his message. Together, the brothers became a force. Tecumseh, the warrior and statesman. Tenskwatawa, the prophet and preacher. Their village, Prophetstown, in what is now Indiana, became the heart of their movement, a gathering place for those determined to resist the tide of American expansion. But standing in their way was Governor William Henry Harrison, the man who would later become president, and the man forever tied to the curse. Harrison was determined to secure more land for settlers. He doubted the power of Tecumseh's Confederacy, and he saw Prophetstown as a threat that had to be broken. The stage was set for confrontation. Tecumseh's vision of unity, Tenskwatawa's fiery sermons, Harrison's ambition, and the relentless push of the United States toward the West, all of these forces collided in the years leading up to 1811. But before the clash at Tippecanoe there were signs. Strange visions, bold warnings, and a prophecy that the white man's power would one day crumble. Tenskwatawa claimed divine inspiration, and many believed him. When the sun was darkened by an eclipse, he used it as proof of his power. When earthquakes shook the land, some said the earth itself was angry. Narrator with weight. This was not just a war of weapons. It was a war of ideas, of spirits, of destinies. And at the center stood Tecumseh, a leader whose brilliance could inspire allies, terrify enemies, and, according to legend, cast a curse that would echo across centuries. By the fall of 1811, the tension on the frontier had become unbearable. On one side stood Prophetstown, the settlement where Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa gathered their confederacy. On the other side, the United States, represented by Governor William Henry Harrison, who commanded both soldiers and political authority in the Indiana Territory. Tecumseh himself was not in Prophetstown at that critical moment. He had gone south, traveling hundreds of miles to recruit more tribes to his confederacy. His absence left his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, in charge. Harrison saw this as his chance. He had grown increasingly uneasy about the growing power of the Confederacy. Prophetstown had become more than just a village, it was a symbol of defiance. Warriors, families, and leaders from many tribes lived or visited there. To Harrison, it was a threat to U.S. control of the frontier. To settlers, it was a gathering storm. So in the autumn of 1811, Harrison led about 1,000 men, soldiers and militia, on a march toward Prophetstown. Their goal was simple: confront the prophet's followers, demand peace, and, if necessary, destroy the village. The two forces came face to face in early November. Harrison's army camped near Prophetstown, on the banks of a creek called the Tippecanoe. Negotiations were supposed to take place, but in the tense, uncertain night of November 6, the fragile calm broke. Before dawn on November 7, 1811, warriors loyal to Tenskwatawa launched a surprise attack. Some accounts say Tenskwatawa promised them protection by magic, assuring them that Harrison's bullets could not harm them. Inspired, the warriors struck swiftly, hoping to overwhelm the American camp. The battle that followed was chaotic, brutal, and close. Harrison's men, though surprised, managed to hold their lines. Gunfire thundered through the darkness. Warriors fought fiercely, but Harrison's soldiers stood firm. After 2 hours of bloody fighting, the native forces retreated. Prophetstown itself was abandoned and later burned by Harrison's men. For Harrison, the Battle of Tippecanoe was declared a victory. He would later use it as the foundation of his fame, even adopting the slogan Tippecanoe and Tyler too in his 1840 presidential campaign. The battle cemented his image as a defender of American expansion. But for the Shawnee and their allies, the outcome was devastating. Prophetstown, their spiritual and political center, was destroyed. Tenskwatawa's credibility as a prophet was shattered. And Tecumseh, returning from his southern journey, found his dream of a great confederacy weakened. Yet from defeat, legend was born. Because the story does not end with a burnt village. It does not end with a wounded movement. According to later accounts, Tecumseh, furious at what had happened, directed his anger not just at Harrison, but at the very office of the presidency. The words vary in different tellings, but the message is clear. Every 20 years, the leader elected in a year ending in 0 would die in office. Harrison, Tecumseh vowed, would not escape. Nor would those who followed him. Whether Tecumseh ever truly spoke these words is uncertain. Historians debate it. Some argue the curse was invented later, shaped by coincidence. Others say it emerged from native oral tradition, a warning whispered and repeated. But whatever its origins, the curse began here, in the smoke of Prophetstown, in the blood spilled at Tippecanoe, in the unquenchable grief of a people who lost their land and their future. A curse does not need to be written to be real. It only needs to be believed. And as the years rolled on, one by one, presidents would fall, each linked back to this battle, this man, and this moment on the banks of the Tippecanoe. History is made of fact. Dates, battles, treaties, names carved in stone. But legends are made of whispers. Whispers that travel further than facts, because they speak not only to the mind, but to the imagination. The Curse of Tippecanoe belongs to this second category. Did Tecumseh truly speak words that doomed American presidents? Did Tenskwatawa, the prophet, call upon spirits to punish his enemies? Or was the curse simply a story, created later, after coincidence piled upon coincidence? The truth is difficult to know. No single written record from the time mentions Tecumseh pronouncing such a curse. Harrison himself, though proud of his so-called victory, never claimed it. Early American newspapers do not print it. And yet the legend persists. How? Perhaps because Tecumseh himself was larger than life. He was not only a warrior and a strategist, but also a man of commanding presence. Those who met him often described his eloquence, his power to move hearts. In the American imagination, such a figure seemed capable of more than ordinary men. If anyone could cast a curse, it would be him. Perhaps, too, the seeds of the curse were planted by Tenskwatawa's prophecies. The prophet often claimed divine inspiration. Before the Battle of Tippecanoe, he told his warriors that bullets would not harm them, a prophecy that proved disastrously false. But later stories remembered him as a man who spoke in visions, predicting the fall of enemies and the punishment of those who wronged his people. And then came the death. When William Henry Harrison himself was elected president in 1840, nearly 30 years after the battle, his victory seemed like destiny fulfilled. Tippecanoe and Tyler too, his campaign song proclaimed, reminding voters of his frontier heroics. But within weeks of his inauguration, Harrison fell ill. After only a month in office, he was dead, the first American president to die while serving. The curse, it seemed, had claimed its first victim. From there, the pattern wrote itself into legend. Every 20 years, a president elected in a year ending in 0 would die. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Harding, Roosevelt, Kennedy. To a superstitious mind, the explanation was simple. Tecumseh's curse had power. To a rational mind, it was chilling coincidence. To a grieving people, native and settler alike, it was a story that gave meaning to tragedy. Because curses are never just about magic. They are about justice. They are about balance. They are about the idea that wrongs do not go unpunished. For the Shawnee and their allies, the destruction of Prophetstown was more than a military defeat. It was the tearing apart of a dream. Tecumseh's Confederacy had been a chance to resist, to stand united. With one battle, that chance was nearly destroyed. For Harrison, the triumph built his career. For Tecumseh's people, it marked another chapter of loss. A curse was the only justice they could imagine. And so the prophecy lived, not in official documents, not in presidential speeches, but in stories, told around fires, whispered in newspapers, passed from generation to generation. By the time of Lincoln, it was already being spoken of. By the time of Kennedy, it was seen as undeniable. A legend does not need proof. It needs repetition. It needs pattern. It needs believers. And as each president fell, belief in the curse only grew. A curse means nothing until it begins to take lives. And for more than a century, the Curse of Tippecanoe seemed unstoppable. One by one, presidents elected in years ending with 0, 1840, 1860, 1880, 1900, 1920, 1940, 1960, each met death in office. The pattern was too neat, too haunting, to be ignored. William Henry Harrison, 1840. In 1840, nearly 30 years after the Battle of Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison rode his frontier fame into the presidency. His campaign slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," reminded voters of his military glory. The log cabin, the hard cider, the rugged frontier general, Harrison was sold as the people's champion. But victory turned to tragedy almost immediately. On a cold March day in 1841, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, coatless in the freezing air. Soon after, he fell ill. Within weeks, he was dead, the first president ever to die in office. 31 days in power. A record-short presidency. Some called it bad luck. Others said it was Tecumseh, exacting his revenge. The curse, if it existed, had begun. Abraham Lincoln, 1860. The next president elected in a year ending in 0 was Abraham Lincoln in 1860. His election tore the country apart, triggering the Civil War. But beyond the cannons and battlefields, Lincoln carried a shadow of doom. Lincoln himself was fascinated by omens and dreams. He once spoke of seeing a double reflection of himself in a mirror, one pale and ghostly, which his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, believed meant he would not survive his second term. And indeed, after guiding the Union to victory, Lincoln was struck down. On April 14, 1865, just days after the Confederate surrender, he was shot by John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater. The nation mourned its first assassinated president. To believers, it was no surprise. Lincoln's election had fallen under the curse. James A. Garfield, 1880. Next came James A. Garfield, elected in 1880. Brilliant, scholarly, and reluctant even to run for president, Garfield nonetheless carried the curse's mark. In July of 1881, only months after taking office, he was shot by a disgruntled office-seeker, Charles Guiteau. Garfield lingered in agony for weeks, but medical incompetence sealed his fate. He died that September. Another president, another death. The curse continued. William McKinley in 1900. The dawn of the new century brought William McKinley back to the White House, re-elected in 1900. But the curse was not fooled by second terms. In September of 1901, while greeting the public at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley was shot by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. He died days later of gangrene. McKinley's death cleared the way for Theodore Roosevelt to become president. But in the shadow of Tippecanoe, it was seen as further proof. The curse demanded its price. Warren G. Harding, 1920. The 1920s began with hope, jazz, prosperity, and the election of Warren G. Harding. Charismatic and popular, Harding promised a return to normalcy after the chaos of World War I. But Harding's presidency was plagued by scandal, corruption, affairs, political betrayal. On a trip to the West Coast in 1923, Harding fell mysteriously ill. He died suddenly in San Francisco. Officially, it was a heart attack, but rumors swirled. Some whispered poisoning, some whispered divine punishment. To Curse believers, it was simply destiny. Franklin D. Roosevelt, a 1940. In 1940, the world was at war. America turned once more to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, re-electing him for an unprecedented third term. Roosevelt carried the nation through the Great Depression and most of World War II. But by his fourth term, his health was failing. On April 12, 1945, while resting in Warm Springs, Georgia, he collapsed from a cerebral hemorrhage. The longest-serving president in U.S. history was gone. Again, the curse had struck, not by bullet but by nature itself. John F. Kennedy in 1960. And then, 1960. The age of television, the Cold War, a new generation. John Fitzgerald Kennedy became the youngest man ever elected president. Handsome, eloquent, full of energy, Kennedy inspired hope across America. But his presidency was brief. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, Kennedy was shot and killed while riding in an open car. The images shocked the world, seared forever into memory. For believers, there was no question. Kennedy's death was the ultimate confirmation. The curse was real. From Harrison to Kennedy, 7 presidents in a row, every one elected in a year ending in 0, had died in office. Coincidence or curse? The answer depends on what you believe. But in the eyes of many, Tecumseh's prophecy had been fulfilled again and again. Yet history is never finished. And the story of the curse did not end in Dallas. Because in 1980, another president would step into the pattern and the world would hold its breath. For more than a century, the pattern held. From Harrison in 1840 to Kennedy in 1960, every president elected in a year ending in 0 had died in office. 7 times in a row. By the time the election of 1980 approached, the curse was legendary. Journalists spoke of it. Historians noted it. Ordinary Americans whispered about it. Some laughed, dismissing it as coincidence. Others wondered, would the curse strike again? The man elected in 1980 was Ronald Reagan, a former Hollywood actor, governor of California, and a charismatic conservative voice. Reagan entered the White House full of optimism and vigor. But in the shadow of the curse, his safety was watched with nervous eyes. And then it happened. On March 30, 1981, just 2 months after his inauguration, Reagan was leaving the Washington Hilton Hotel when a man stepped from the crowd. His name was John Hinckley Jr. He carried a revolver. And he fired. 6 bullets cracked through the air. One struck a police officer. Another wounded Reagan's press secretary, James Brady. A third bullet ricocheted off the presidential limousine and buried itself in Reagan's chest, just inches from his heart. The president collapsed, bleeding. For a moment it seemed certain, the curse had struck again. But history took a different turn. Reagan survived. Surgeons worked for hours, removing the bullet, repairing the damage. Against the odds, he recovered. And not only recovered, he went on to serve 2 full terms, becoming one of the longest-living American presidents in history. The curse had faltered. For the first time in nearly 150 years, the pattern had been broken. Still, some asked, had it truly been broken or merely weakened? Because the next test came in the year 2000, when George W. Bush was elected. Bush entered the White House in a storm of controversy, the outcome of the Florida recount hanging in the balance. Once again, the year ended in 0. Once again, the curse loomed. And once again, danger struck. On September 11, 2001, the United States was attacked by terrorists. Planes struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Thousands died. The president himself was rushed to safety. For hours, no one knew if Bush was alive, if the government would endure. Though Bush survived the attacks, the shadow of the curse seemed to hang over his presidency. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq followed. Assassination plots were rumored. But when Bush left office in 2009, alive, the curse seemed to have lost its grip completely. Did Reagan's survival prove the curse was never real? Did Bush's safe exit from the White House end it once and for all? Or did Tecumseh's spirit, after 7 presidents, finally rest? Legends are rarely clear. They shift with time, with belief, with the needs of those who tell them. Some still insist the curse is real, only dormant. Others believe it was coincidence all along. But one thing is certain. The story remains whispered every 20 years as America waits to see if the pattern will return. Because curses do not die easily. Especially ones written in blood. A story is never just a story. It is a mirror. A way to see what we fear, what we hope, and how we make sense of the inexplicable. The Curse of Tippecanoe is one such story. To some, it is undeniable proof of supernatural justice. To others, it is nothing more than coincidence. But whether true or not, the legend reveals deep truths about America itself. Let us begin with the skeptic's eye. Mathematically, patterns emerge in history simply by chance. Between 1840 and 1960, the deaths of 7 presidents in office seem extraordinary. But when examined closely, each case has its own explanation. Harrison died of pneumonia after ignoring warnings about his health. Lincoln was assassinated during the chaos of Civil War. Garfield was killed by a lone madman. McKinley fell to an anarchist in a violent era. Harding collapsed from heart trouble. Roosevelt's health had been failing for years. Kennedy was cut down in the Cold War climate of hatred and conspiracy. Each tragedy had roots in politics, in disease, in circumstance. None required a curse. And yet, the coincidences pile too neatly. 7 in a row. All elected in years ending with 0. All dead in office. To dismiss the pattern entirely feels unsatisfying. This is where legend fills the gap. Humans crave meaning. We want stories that explain not just the how but the why. Why do the powerful fall? Why do leaders, chosen at the peak of glory, meet such sudden ends? A curse provides the answer. For native peoples, the legend carried even deeper weight. Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa represented one of the last great efforts to stop American expansion. Their defeat marked the loss of land, culture, and sovereignty. The curse, then, was not only revenge, it was memory. A way to keep Tecumseh alive, even as his people were pushed aside. Every time a president fell, it was as though history itself whispered, "The Shawnee have not been forgotten." For Americans outside the native world, the curse offered something else: awe. It gave the presidency a mystical danger, a reminder that power comes with a price. It turned politics into destiny, history into fate. The answer depends not on documents or data, but on belief. Curses exist not in the laws of science, but in the minds of those who repeat them. And in that sense, the Curse of Tippecanoe is very real indeed. Even after Reagan's survival, even after Bush walked away unharmed, the legend has not died. Every 20 years, whispers rise again. In 2020, some even wondered, would the curse return? Would the cycle reawaken? It did not. But the question lingers. Perhaps that is the true power of a curse, not the deaths it causes, but the shadow it casts. A shadow that falls across history, shaping the way we see it, long after the facts are gone. History is not only what happened. It is what we choose to remember, and how we choose to tell it. The story of the Curse of Tippecanoe has endured for nearly 2 centuries. Not because it can be proven, but because it speaks to something deeper in the American spirit, the uneasy relationship between conquest and consequence. Tecumseh was more than a warrior. He was a visionary who dreamed of unity among native peoples, a leader who saw the storm of expansion and sought to resist it. His brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet, added spiritual fire to that resistance. Together, they forged a moment of hope that the Shawnee and their allies might hold their ground. That dream ended in flames at Tippecanoe, and later in Tecumseh's death during the War of 1812. But if his body was silenced, his legend was not. Through the story of the curse, Tecumseh's voice still speaks. It reminds America that the taking of land, the breaking of treaties, and the erasure of cultures do not go unanswered. Each time a president died, the nation was shaken. Each time, the curse was remembered. And so Tecumseh's name, instead of fading into obscurity, remained alive in the minds of millions who might otherwise have forgotten him. Perhaps that is the true power of the curse, not in striking down presidents, but in ensuring that the Shawnee leader, and the people he fought for, are never erased from history. But legends are slippery things. Some see the curse as proof of supernatural justice, others as nothing more than coincidence stitched into story. And still others view it as a cultural mirror, showing us what we fear most. That power, no matter how great, cannot protect against fate. What is certain is this: every 20 years the story awakens. When a president is elected in a year ending in 0, questions return. Will the curse strike again? Has it ended forever? Or is it merely waiting? Even in our modern world of satellites and science, the legend lingers. It is told in classrooms, whispered in documentaries, written in books. Journalists dust it off with every news cycle. Because curses, whether real or imagined, carry a strange kind of truth. They remind us that history is fragile, that choices echo, that what is buried is never truly gone. The Curse of Tippecanoe is more than a pattern of death. It is a story of resistance, of memory, of the cost of power. From Harrison's short month in office to Kennedy's tragic ride in Dallas, from Reagan's brush with death to Bush's survival, it is a thread that winds through American history like a ghostly hand. Perhaps it is broken. Perhaps it was never real. Or perhaps Tecumseh's shadow still walks among the presidents, watching, waiting. Only time will tell.